I really kind of like to understand sort of the history and sort of state of compliance for sales tax, because it seems like it's kind of gone through these periods of nobody cares about sales tax and states aren't really doing anything about it. And then a few years ago, obviously with some changes to the laws, now everyone's like, sales tax, have to be compliant. And so what is it sort of like today? And just give us your 30,000 foot view.
Yeah, so before, like you said, no one needed to care about it, and no one actually did care about it because selling online wasn't a big thing back then, right? Most of your retail stores or brick and mortar stores were the main ways of buying products.
Basically just the front-end sales channel. He developed a strategy because in his own business he wasn't profitable with the strategy.
It's clearly working wonders for our clients, and it's crazy to me how many agencies don't know about this at all.
Welcome, everybody. We're excited to have our special guest, Lahari, Neela Peretti from TaxHero.net. Today, we are obviously talking about everybody's favorite topic when it comes to e-commerce, and that's sales tax. So Lahari, welcome to the show. I know you're going to just provide us a ton of really awesome insight into a topic that we as e-commerce sellers have a tendency to try to ignore and stick our head in the sand and not care about until we get nasty letters that freak us out and then make us care about it.
Yeah, first of all, Kyle, thank you for having me on the show. I'm going to try my best to make the least sexiest topic, sales tax,
Yes.
maybe a little bit more interesting and applicable to hopefully the e-commerce leaders out there.
Amazing. That's what we're looking for. Just somebody needs to boil it down for us because we do not want to become experts in sales tax by any means.
Yeah, of course, yes.
I love it. So my first question to you is, I really kind of like to understand sort of the history and sort of state of compliance for sales tax, because it seems like it's kind of gone through these periods of nobody cares about sales tax and states aren't really doing anything about it. And then a few years ago, obviously with some changes to the laws, now everyone's like, sales tax, have to be compliant. And so what is it sort of like today? And just give us your 30,000 foot view of sales tax compliance for e-commerce sellers right now.
Yeah, so before, like you said, no one needed to care about it, and no one actually did care about it because selling online wasn't a big thing back then, right? Most of your retail stores or brick and mortar stores were the main ways of buying products. So it was pretty easy. You really met requirements, and sales tax was really applicable if you had like a physical presence or a store or employees in that location, and those rules still apply to this day. So that's an easy one. What states started seeing and realizing, obviously, is that there was a lot of transactions that were happening more online and more through e-commerce. So in 2018, which is why it's still in the recent years, there was a law that was passed, the Wayfair versus South Dakota. That's like the famous thing in the sales tax world, regulations. But that is where states started coming out with, and each state independently and at different times, but it started with South Dakota. South Dakota actually came out with it in 2016, I believe, where they passed a law that like, hey, if you meet certain revenue threshold or transaction threshold, you need to start collecting in our state. In 2018 is when it kind of went viral across all states. And that's when states started making their own, threshold. Majority of states still keeping to the same thing, 100,000 revenue in that state or 200 order transactions. Larger states started doing larger, thresholds, but that's why it became such a big thing for e-commerce business owners. And then you obviously know COVID hit in 2020. I think states now are becoming more diligent about making sure they get the money that they think that they should have gotten from the beginning. And that's why you're even seeing more audits and more compliance and more letters, because obviously states are trying to recoup some of the revenue that they lost during COVID time too, right? And so this is why you're kind of seeing that more and more.
That makes a lot of sense. And you kind of touched on a little bit where different states have different thresholds, right? So one of the questions that sort of pop up is, do you need to collect sales tax for every state where you sell products online? even if you're not based in that state?
Yeah. And the answer to that is no. You should not actually just like start collecting in all those states if you don't meet the requirements. Again, like I said, majority, I will say 50% of states do that $100,000 in sales or 200 transactions in it. Most companies will meet that 200 transactions over that 100,000. But like the large states like California, Texas, New York, like the states that are largest, their actually dollar threshold is 500,000. And like Texas and California don't have an order threshold. And New York is 500,000 and 100 transactions in that state. So those large states, it's actually like until you sell that large volume into it, you don't need to do it. And then the other remaining, I would say 50% of states mainly just do no order threshold, but just the dollar. And the dollar threshold makes sense, right? Like, so you can kind of gauge like, hey, until I get to $1 million in sales, do I even need to be checking this, right? Like maybe not, right? But it's where the transactions, that volume and that threshold, those states that do that, that's where it becomes a little bit of challenge to like even small businesses.
Sure. And that's revenue generated in sales in that state.
Correct. So products shipped to that state.
Right.
Correct.
Oh, interesting. And so part of that then comes down to the idea of Nexus.
Yes.
Right. That's a term that you've probably heard a little bit. Like, what is it? What does it mean? So maybe you could break that down a little bit for us. Like, what is Nexus? How does it apply to e-commerce sellers?
Yeah. So Nexus is basically what that means is presence in that state. So they have two types of Nexus that, physical presence, which is what I was talking about earlier, where, hey, this has always been there. So if you have employees in a state, if you have inventory held in that state, an office, if you as like the founder live in a state, or any of your, founders or, co-founders and stuff live in a state, you're required to register and collect sales tax in those states. That's the easy peasy one, right? Like, when you're registering, which is why a lot of e-commerce business owners will register in Delaware. Delaware is one of the states that does not have sales tax. So just because you're registered there, you don't have to, obviously, there's no sales tax to collect. The second part, which is mainly targets e-commerce sellers, is that economic nexus. That is what I was talking about with the thresholds. Like each state has its own threshold. And if you cross that threshold of products shipped to that state, then you need to register, start collecting sales tax, and then remitting it.
That makes sense. So what if you actually hold inventory in that state, but you do not actually meet the filing threshold in terms of dollars or orders shipped?
So you still have to register because the physical presence goes first. So you check that first. Like, where do you hold inventory? Where do you have employees? Where do you have offices? Those states you have to register. And then the rest you're monitoring. Some people monthly, some people, some businesses quarterly, annually, whatever, based on your volume of business, you're monitoring if you meet those thresholds after you've already registered with the states that you meet the physical nexus.
Yeah, perfect. No, that makes a lot of sense. Now, for some sellers, well, actually many sellers, they will be omni-channel, right? They're going to sell through different platforms and marketplaces. So like Amazon versus Shopify. And Amazon has sort of come out and done the marketplace facilitator, where they're basically taking the tax and then they're forced to remit it to the states based on laws that are passed. I think it started here in Washington State, actually, where Amazon's out of. They're like, hey, Amazon, you collect it, you can pay us. But you still have to report it, right? Like, I do sales tax out of the state of Washington, and you still have to say, hey, yeah, we collect, or Amazon collected it, Amazon remitted it, but we still have to report it within our sales tax filings. How does that sort of interplay and sort of come together when you are both Shopify and Amazon across all these different states?
Yeah, so that's the fun part, right? of this whole omni-channel, because that is what every e-commerce business owner should be looking into doing, multi-channel, right? And then in some ways, I will say that like this makes it easier if you are on Amazon, eBay, and that, those type of marketplace facilitators is what they call, where multiple companies can sell on their platform. So that does, like you said, they do have to be reported on there. It does make it a little bit, the other thing that makes it a little bit more complicated is that the threshold that I was just talking about, the economic nexus, some states will actually require you to include your marketplace facilitator sales in your threshold. And then again, this becomes like 50-50. Like 50% of states actually say, you don't need to, you just need to include the states that are, that you actually tax on, or taxable sales that you might have. And then some states are like, no, we want you to include your marketplace facilitator sales too. And so then obviously if you're selling on Amazon, you're going to meet those thresholds a lot quicker than if you were just selling on your website, right? Especially with the transaction stuff. So it puts a little bit more burden on obviously the e-commerce owner. And it also puts a little bit more burden to get the information from Amazon of how much sales were collected in that state. It's not like an easy thing that's given, on like a dashboard or anything. So it is a little bit more complicated of you have to get the data when you're filing the return of how much were your marketplace sales in that state that they already reported, Amazon did, or, your other channels that are marketplace facilitators, and what you need to include on your return when you're filing it.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. So it can get complex then, is what you're saying,
yes.
Depending on where you're selling. And then obviously if you're selling on Amazon and you're using their fulfillment network, they're moving inventory all over to different states, and you have different sort of economic nexus now because you're holding inventory there that you need to be aware of and planning for, right?
Yeah.
Because what you don't want to have happen is you ignore it and then you start getting all these fun letters that are from years and years back, and then you have penalties and all that kind of fun stuff, which I've experienced, right? When that happened, California was kind enough to send me letters about remitting sales tax for prior years, and so we went through that process and had to do I think 3 or 4 years of sales tax they wanted to go ahead and capture. So what are the, I guess, penalties, right? If you kind of ignore it and you let it kind of go and you're not paying attention to it, what are states typically doing?
See, you kind of experienced it firsthand, and I think this is where people kind of get caught up, or they're like, it doesn't really matter. It's like, if the states come after you and they see that, they send you a letter because you had inventory, you're actually paying not just the penalties, but the back taxes. So what you should have been collecting and remitting to that state. So if, let's say that you held inventory in an Amazon warehouse in California, like you gave, right? And you are selling on your website as well. You're selling on your Shopify website to customers in California. For when you started meeting that requirement to when, basically for the entire time you didn't collect, now you as a business owner are paying out of pocket,
right,
to pay those sales tax. Because before it's you're just collecting from the end customer and then you're paying it to the state. It's just more of an admin headache than anything, right? But here now you're hurting your cash flow by having to pay that 8%, 7%, whatever the state percents are, right? Of that. And then on top of that, some of the states will assess a 2% penalty, right? On that. And then interest for how much time that you have not collected, and, however much that time looks like, right? That interest based on that's been accruing. So it becomes very detrimental to, I would say any business of any size, which is why I say the least you can do is know your liabilities.
Yep.
Is if you don't have the, effort, or you don't have the team to help you, or just even, money to pay another third party to do it for you. Step one is just finding out what your liabilities are, or what your liabilities could be, so that you know what you're getting yourself into, so you can make that basically educated decision. That's
great. Yeah, I think it's one of those things that obviously when you're first getting started, if you're starting from scratch, if you're launching a new e-commerce brand or a new product and you're just trying to get product market fit, you're trying to understand if there's viable. Once you kind of get past that stage, it makes a ton of sense for you to start thinking about compliance in a really practical way. And the earlier that you do it, the earlier that you sort of embrace we just need to make sure we're squared away, the
Yep.
cheaper it's going to be for you in the long run, because the longer you let it run and you ignore it, the more expensive it's going to be. Because when California came and sending me those nice letters, those were not small checks that you're like writing out to them in order to do it. So, like it was an expensive, basically I was just, California loaned me the money and then I had to pay it back with interest. And it's not really the best business choice to make. So take care of it, figure out your compliance early on, and then you can kind of scale into it and plan accordingly.
Yeah, exactly.
No, that's great. One question too that I sort of come across and people have asked me before is, like, how often do you have to file these sales tax returns? Because that can become a pretty big compliance headache. If you have your 5 or 6 states and they all have different timelines, like how does that sort of factor in, and what do you recommend?
Yeah, so most states, every state will assign you a filing frequency. They assign it to you. So they'll either give you monthly, quarterly, or annual. Most of the states will do it based on your revenue in that state. So if you're not doing that much revenue dollar wise, but you met it because of the transactions, right? Like you had 250 transactions and your revenue in that state could be $10K. Most likely they're going to give you an annual frequency because you're not collecting that much in sales tax for you to file monthly or quarterly. Some states will automatically, like California, usually just goes with quarterly most of the time. And you can appeal it and say, hey, I want to do monthly, or I want to do annually. And you'll be surprised. We get clients that will say, hey, for cash flow purposes, I'd rather just pay that out monthly because I just want it out of my bank. So I don't have to think of it at all. And that's just their preference. So we will kind of, go back to the state and get them to do that. But again, the states, technically you don't get to really pick. It's really the states that are picking your filing frequency. But if you're doing a lot of revenue in that state, you can expect to do monthly. If you're not, you can expect either quarterly or annual.
That makes sense. But you can actually request it from the state. Say you're at a quarterly and you're I'm doing tiny little volume. Maybe going to annual will lower your sort of compliance requirement. Instead of filing quarterly, you just do it one time annually and you're off the races. That's a good insight and takeaway too, because sometimes we just whatever they say, we do it. But if it's actually going to be simpler to switch it to the timing of it, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. And I will say that some states will automatically send you letters because they see that your revenue has dropped or increased. And they'll say, hey, your filing frequency changed from annual to quarterly. Because I think it's also in the state's best interest not to process as many returns, to be honest, because for them too, they don't have that many people in their revenue department to begin with. Sure. So they're also very good about keeping up with that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So for me, when I think about taxes, it's step one, it's making sure you are registered where you need to be, right? So that's okay, compliance step number one, I got to go through all that stuff. Then step number two is okay, now I need to track sales tax appropriately. And then also make sure we're staying up to date in the tax rate collection of it, right? So I think, talk a little bit about that. So some of the tools like Shopify has sort of tax rates that I think they're pulling in that data now automatically. Amazon is obviously pulling it in if they're collecting for you on that behalf. But what's the easiest way to sort of keep track of that collection process so that you're aware of what you're going to owe, if anything, to a state?
Yeah, the good thing is all the technologies have very, very much evolved for the sales tax. Shopify Shopify is one of the ones that does the best job, I would say, with the calculator. There's already an inbuilt one that they have that's their basic Shopify that you don't have to even pay for to collect sales tax and calculate the rate. It's not the most exact, I will be honest. It's not going, because sales tax goes by your geolocation, right? And they're doing it by your basic zip code.
Sure.
Which is close enough, to be honest, right? It's close enough to get you the right rate in material ways. They did release their new version of Shopify Tax, which is more accurate. It's based on their geolocation. It is something that you have to pay for your order volume, but they do a very good job. And especially if you have products that are, not taxable in certain states, but taxable in other, food, feminine hygiene products, clothing, right? Those products, like those are like for us, like our clients that sell those products, we'd like them to be on Shopify tax because it's even more exact. And Shopify actually does the job for you on figuring out if it's taxable or not in that state. You might have to do some back-end configurations, like some of our clients, we do that. Like we have to configure it even more because it's like each product could be unique. Like electrolytes is a good example of product that like, honestly, states haven't evolved into like figuring out on their own tax code if electrolytes are taxable or not. There's like a little bit of like things that you might have to do on the back end, but honestly, that Amazon takes care of the calculation for you. So you don't even get paid the sales tax. You don't even see it. You just customer sees it. They deduct it from your payment. So they calculate it pretty well, eBay, all of them. And then there was obviously other sales tax calculators you can, plug into, like Avalara is the biggest one that everyone plugs into, but it's not really needed as much anymore, right? Because if you're really on Shopify and you're on other marketplaces, they do the sales tax for you. Where else do you need it, right?
Right. Yeah. No, that makes a ton of sense. So I think the biggest question I get from sellers that we interact with is, what if we realize we haven't been collecting sales tax and we probably should have been? What should we probably do? Like, I get that question quite a bit.
Yeah. So again, I would love, I hate saying this answer, but it depends right now.
Right. Yeah.
In a way it kind of does. And that's where like, I would say sitting down with a sales tax professional is like actually important because like for us, I'll give us an example. When we get clients like that have, most clients are like, should have been collecting and they haven't. We try to figure out state by state what to do and what their liability was.
Right.
Strategically, we will figure out what the plan of action is.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense.
Some states, they reached it like maybe last year, end of last year, it wasn't that much. So it's like, hey, let's just start registering now and collecting now and remitting now. Some states, it could be like a huge amount that we're like, okay, do you want, like, again, you're taking a risk of the liability if they come after you. They're obviously going to know your sales. So do you want to do a voluntary disclosure and work out some deal with the state by saying, hey, I'm going to disclose this. I can't pay all this, but like, let's pay XYZ, And so it is a little bit more strategic with state by state. And we can kind of tell like which states are obviously like, we all know like the state of California is not very lenient when it comes to stuff like this. So it's like, you got to be careful with what you do there, and some states are a little bit nicer and a little bit more lenient than others. So it does depend.
Yeah, no, that's good advice. At one point in my career, I was closely involved with taxes. And one of the most favorite responses of that was, it depends. So I totally tracked that. That was the classic response because it truly does, right? It's very contingent upon the situation and it's just the nature of tax code. Like it really does depend because there are a number of different scenarios that can play out. But I thought that was funny. That kind of made me laugh a bit because that brought me back. It depends.
It's the classic. Typical answer of what you would even get when you call any sales tax professional.
Yeah, exactly. Any tax professional. It depends. It depends, right? Because that's how the code works. No, I think that's great. So basically, it's take action, get some professional assistance. Would be sort of step number one. And then I think one of the other things is internationally, when you want to kind of branch out a little bit into maybe Canada or the UK or the EU, right? What are some considerations you really have to think through from that standpoint?
Yeah, so not just with the taxes portion, like that's a big thing, right? I always say like, whenever somebody's looking into getting internationally, they need to do an analysis by country if it's even worth getting into that country.
Sure.
And taxes, duties, obviously tariffs, that's a big thing. Yep. But I also say like even the shipping, like how does that, like look at your margin of your product to begin with and work down to see if it's even worth getting into that country. And I would say like including like you're going to have to pay outsourced accountants, right? Like to do some of this VAT, GST, all this that that you'll have to do with international taxes because you don't want to deal with it. Any fees that will come in, even merchant fees, right? Like I know Shopify launched their Shopify Managed Market, which is like getting into international markets or trying to make it easier for e-commerce, Shopify store owners to kind of get in there. But you take a cut, right? So it's like I always tell everybody that they need to look at it by country because it is very different. Yeah. And it all really comes down to like, are you going to make money off of it? And if you are, like, when are you going to break even and at what volume? And is it worth going into their launch into that market?
Yeah, it's really good advice because one of the other things that you have to be aware of, particularly if you're going to launch in, say, Europe or even the UK, is they have different compliance rules. You know, for example, in the EU, they rolled out their responsible person and all of their contact information for manufacturing, right? Then you have to have it on the label, or you have to have a responsible person on your product detail page that someone can click and say, who's the person that I contact about this particular product as it's imported, from wherever you import. Even if you made the product here in the States and you were selling it in Germany or France or wherever, you still have to have a responsible person available for them to contact, right? So that's an additional compliance level cost that you have to sort of factor into your thinking around stuff. So it does make sense to really get a good, clear understanding of what the compliance looks like, what sales like that looks like, what shipping costs look like, all of that, and really understand those numbers before you just sort of dive in and jump in. Because if you're on Amazon, for example, it's really easy for you to just be like, expand global. Like they make it really simple. Like just start selling in like different marketplaces, right? Like hit some buttons and you're good to go. But then you're sort of like realizing, oh, this is like literally launching on an entirely different platform, because you're learning new rules and new compliance things that you have to keep in mind. And it can take you some time before you're really kind of gaining any traction. So I kind of tell people, like, if you're thinking about expanding internationally, even if you're on Amazon and you have a lot of experience on Amazon, you need to approach it like you're launching something from scratch with the same amount of like effort and energy, and like you're rolling it out totally new, because it's going to take that amount of time to really gain some insight and mastery into it. So I mean it's an important piece of it, but awesome. Well, this has been really fantastic. So tell us a little bit more about like TaxHero.net. That's the company that you're the CEO of, and I'd love to kind of hear about that and what you do and how you help people.
Yeah, so TaxHero is basically an all-inclusive full stack sales tax solution. So it came out of the need. It was, what I like to say is like, it's for founders, for e-commerce and CPG founders. And it's built by, my background is an accountant, I'm a CPA, so is my co-founder, but it's built by accountants. So the way we kind of do things is a little bit different. We are the full-blown service side of sales tax, but we leverage our software to basically automate as much as we can as well. So there's still a software component of it, but we kind of pride ourselves in that service. So we do everything from like configuring the back end of your Shopify to helping you figure out where you meet those Nexus requirements, registering you in those states, remitting the returns in the states, handling sales tax audits, and even answering customer support questions that you'll be shocked to hear that customers have questions about, hey, why was I charged this rate and when I'm located here? So we help answer that for our clients as well, and pretty much do the entire service related to sales tax. And we do it for one inclusive price versus like piecemealing it as you go. So that's what makes us kind of different than other providers out there. And so we work with any company of any size. It doesn't matter how large or how small you are, as long as you're on Shopify. That's our ideal customer at the moment. In the future, we'll be opening up more integrations, but right now, as long as your website backend is on Shopify, even if you're omni-channel, we can still work with you as well.
That's very, very cool. Well, I would tell anybody, if you have any sales tax questions and you're looking to do that, they can reach out to you and get in touch at TaxHero.net, right? And they can also email you, right? Lahari at TaxHero.net, right? So we'll have those links available in the show notes as well for people. So if you have a sales tax question, regardless whether you're at in the process, whether you're like, I've done nothing with sales tax, or I've done the minimum and I think might have some other liability, they can open up a conversation with you and you can kind of help navigate them through that process. So
yes, I'm happy to answer any question for free, of course. And thank you for Kyle for having us on here as well. And hopefully we were able to provide some valuable insights about sales.
Yes, it's the most exciting topic in e-commerce, sales tax. It's one of those topics where you want it to continue to be boring for you.
Yeah.
If everything is going right, it should be boring. You shouldn't have to think about it. It's when it becomes not boring, when it becomes emergent, when it becomes a fire you have to put out. That's when you're like, and let's try to avoid that from happening, right? And so getting very good, competent help, talking to experts allow you to let it stay boring in your business. And that's exactly where you want to keep it. So with that, Lahari, thanks so much for your time and your expertise. And we look forward to chatting with you in the future.
Yeah. Thanks, Kyle.
Yep. Thanks. Bye all.